There are secrets that win wars, and there are men who carry those secrets invisible to history, whose names dissolve into silence, even as their actions change the world. This is the story of one such man, a slave who walked between armies, who whispered in the ears of generals, who held the fate of a nation in his hands while wearing chains on his wrists. His intelligence decided the outcome of the American Revolution. Yet when victory came, when cannons fell silent and treaties were signed, his name was nowhere to be found. He died as he had lived, invisible, forgotten, erased. But the truth, as it always does, remained buried in documents waiting to be uncovered, and the truth is darker, more dangerous, and more extraordinary than anyone could imagine. This is not a story of heroes. This is a story about a man who changed history and then watched history forget him. The plantation stretched across New Kent County like a kingdom of tobacco and suffering. 300 acres of Virginia soil worked by 63 human beings who were legally classified as property. The main house stood white and column-emed, a monument to prosperity built on the backs of people who would never own anything, not even themselves. James had been born there in 1760, though no one recorded the exact date. Slave births were noted in ledgers the way livestock births were noted. A simple entry, a name if you were fortunate, a gender, a potential future value. His mother had been a house servant named Ruth. His father a field worker whose name James never learned because he was sold to a plantation in South Carolina before James could form memories. Ruth raised him with the particular kind of careful love that enslaved mothers developed, fierce but tempered, protective but realistic. She taught him early that survival meant understanding the unspoken rules of the plantation world. Never look a white person directly in the eyes for too long. Never show anger no matter what was done to you. Never reveal what you were thinking. Your face, your body language, your very posture had to communicate submission even when your mind screamed rebellion. You got a mind, baby, Ruth whispered to him when he was perhaps 7 years old, holding him close in the dark of their cabin. A good mind, sharp, but you can't never let them see it. A slave with a mind is dangerous to them. You keep that mind hidden. You hear me? You keep it locked up tight, and maybe someday it saves your life. James learned to watch. The plantation was a complex social ecosystem, and understanding its dynamics meant the difference between relative safety and sudden violence. He learned which overseers were merely cruel and which were sadistic. He learned which house servants had the master's ear and which could be trusted. He learned to read the weather patterns of William Armistead's moods, when the master was generous, when he was angry, when he was drunk and dangerous. William Armistead was not the worst master in Virginia, which was a low bar to clear. He beat his slaves rarely, fed them adequately, and occasionally expressed vague discomfort with the institution of slavery while continuing to profit from it. He considered himself an enlightened man, a reader of philosophy, a believer in the natural rights of mankind, at least in the abstract. The contradiction between his stated beliefs and his daily practice never seemed to trouble him deeply. The plantation operated with mechanical efficiency. Dawn brought the bells that woke the enslaved population. Breakfast was cornmeal mush, sometimes with a bit of salt pork if you were fortunate. Then the fields, endless tobacco plants that needed constant attention. Planting season, growing season, harvesting season, curing season. The cycle repeated itself with agricultural certainty, and James's childhood disappeared into that cycle year after year. But James was different in ways that even he didn't fully understand yet. While other children played during their brief moments of free time, James observed, he watched how the overseers organized work details and learned to anticipate their commands. He listened when house servants gossiped about the master's business dealings and began to understand economics. He paid attention when traveling merchants visited the plantation and absorbed information about the wider world beyond New Kent County. He couldn't read. Teaching slaves to read was illegal in Virginia, punishable by fines or worse. But he developed a different kind of literacy. He learned to read people, to understand what they wanted before they spoke it, to anticipate needs and fulfill them before being asked. This made him valuable, which made him relatively safe. By the time James reached his teenage years, he had been promoted from pure field work to more complex tasks. He worked in the stables, caring for the master's horses. He helped maintain equipment, demonstrating an intuitive mechanical understanding. He ran errands to neighboring plantations, proving himself trustworthy enough to be allowed limited freedom of movement, and all the while, he watched, listened, remembered everything. The whispers of revolution began reaching the plantation in the early 1770s. Travelers brought newspapers. House servants overheard dinner conversations about something called the Stamp Act. The town's hens mounting tensions with Parliament. James absorbed these fragments of information, piecing together a picture of growing colonial discontent. In 1775, fighting broke out in Massachusetts. Lexington and Concord became names that echoed through Virginia. The Continental Congress in Philadelphia declared independence in July 1776, and suddenly, Virginia's plantation aristocracy found itself leading a revolutionary war while simultaneously maintaining a system of human bondage. The irony was not lost on the enslaved population. White men spoke passionately about liberty, natural rights, and freedom from tyranny while keeping other human beings in chains. The contradiction was glaring, absurd, and deeply revealing. But James understood something that more radical slaves sometimes didn't. Contradictions created opportunities. A society at war with itself, fighting for principles it didn't fully practice, was a society in flux. And in that flux, a clever person might find room to maneuver. When British armies invaded Virginia in 1779, the plantation world began to fracture. British commanders seeking to destabilize the colonial economy and weaken revolutionary resolve issued proclamations offering freedom to any slave who abandoned their rebel masters and joined the king's forces. Thousands accepted the offer, fleeing plantations and running toward British lines. The plantation population on the Armistead estate dropped from 63 to 41 in a matter of months. William Armistead fumed about British treachery and the ingratitude of slaves. He increased security, hired additional overseers, and made examples of anyone caught planning escape. James watched the runaways go with mixed feelings. Part of him wanted to join them, to run toward the promise of British freedom, but another part, the part that watched and calculated, wondered if that promise was genuine. The British were offering freedom as a military strategy, not out of moral conviction. What would happen to those formerly enslaved people when the war ended? Would they truly be free, or would they simply be used and discarded? He didn't know, but he filed the information away, understanding that this moment of historical chaos might present opportunities he couldn't yet imagine. In early 1781, the war came directly to New Kent County. British forces under the traitor Benedict Arnold raided through Virginia, burning and looting. They were followed by Continental Army forces trying desperately to contain the damage. The plantation became a waypoint in a military campaign, hosting soldiers from both sides at different times, and that's when James met the man who would change his life. Mar Joseph Paul Yves Rowe, Gilbert du Motier. Marc de Lafayette was 23 years old and approximately as idealistic as a human being could be without actually floating off the ground. He was tall, red-haired, awkward in a particularly aristocratic way, and absolutely convinced that the American cause was the most righteous endeavor in human history. He had arrived in America 4 years earlier, a teenager with more noble blood than practical military experience, determined to fight for liberty. General George Washington had initially regarded him as a wealthy nuisance, another European aristocrat playing at war. But Lafayette proved himself through genuine courage, tactical intelligence, and an almost reckless willingness to put himself in danger. Washington came to regard him almost as a son. By spring 1781, Lafayette commanded Continental forces in Virginia with orders to contain British operations until reinforcements could arrive. He was outnumbered, undersupplied, and facing some of Britain's most experienced commanders. His army consisted of barely 3,000 men, many of them inexperienced militia. Discipline was inconsistent, supplies were scarce, and morale fluctuated between determined and desperate. What Lafayette needed more than anything was intelligence. In war, information was as valuable as ammunition. He needed to know where British forces were positioned, where they were going, what their supply situations looked like, what their commanders were planning. Without accurate intelligence, he was fighting blind. The problem was that conventional reconnaissance was nearly impossible. British forces controlled most of the territory, and any Continental scout risked immediate capture. Loyalist civilians reported suspicious activity to British commanders, making it difficult for rebel spies to operate effectively. Lafayette understood something that many of his fellow officers, particularly those from aristocratic European backgrounds, struggled to grasp: that the people most invisible in American society could become the most effective intelligence gatherers. Enslaved Africans moved through the landscape like furniture, seen but not truly observed, present but not counted as significant. A slave moving between plantations attracted no attention. A slave approaching British lines with a story about seeking freedom was expected, even encouraged. Lafayette had employed black spies before with remarkable success. He trusted them more than he trusted many of his white officers, recognizing that they had genuine motivation, personal freedom, revenge against the system that enslaved them, rather than abstract political principles. When his forces established a temporary encampment near the Armistead plantation in late March 1781, Lafayette made a point of meeting with the plantation owner. William Armistead received the young French general with the careful hospitality that Virginia aristocrats extended to those of equivalent social status, even revolutionary ones. They dined in the plantation house, Lafayette, Armistead, and several Continental offices. The conversation ranged across military strategy, political philosophy, and the peculiar contradictions of a revolution for liberty being fought by slaveholders. Lafayette, with characteristic European directness, questioned how Americans could speak of natural rights while maintaining slavery. Armistead offered the standard Virginia responses. Slavery was inherited, not chosen. It was economically necessary. It would gradually fade away as society evolved. Many masters treated their slaves humanely. The rationalizations flowed smoothly, polished by repetition. Lafayette wasn't convinced, but he was pragmatic. He needed resources more than he needed ideological purity, and he needed intelligent sources. "I understand you have an enslaved man named James," Lafayette said, shifting the conversation. "I'm told he's intelligent, trustworthy, and familiar with the surrounding territory." Armistead nodded cautiously. "Yes, he's been with the plantation his entire life. Capable worker. I'd like to speak with him about a matter of some importance to the Continental cause." What followed was a negotiation framed as a patriotic discussion. Armistead was reluctant to risk valuable property, but eager to demonstrate his revolutionary credentials. Lafayette suggested that James's service might reflect well on the Armistead family, perhaps even result in favorable consideration when the new government distributed lands and honors after independence was secured. The unspoken understanding was clear. Armistead would loan his slave to the Continental Army for intelligence work, and in return would gain political capital and potential future advantages. James himself was not part of this negotiation. He was informed of the decision after it had been made, told to report to Lafayette's tent the following morning. He spent that night lying awake in his cabin, understanding that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. His mother had died 2 years earlier from fever, and he had no wife or children yet. Nothing tying him emotionally to the plantation beyond the general familiarity of routine. Part of him was terrified. Another part was curious, even excited. This was the opportunity he had unconsciously been waiting for. The morning came gray and cool, the early spring air still carrying winter's edge. James walked to the Continental encampment with the careful posture he had perfected over a lifetime, subservient, but not cringing, respectful, but not graveling. He was 20 years old, though he looked older. Hard, lab-ridged people quickly. Lafayette received him in a tent that smelled of canvas, gun oil, and the peculiar mustastininess of military equipment stored in damp conditions. The French general sat behind a camp desk covered with maps and correspondence. He gestured for James to sit, which was surprising. Masters rarely invited slaves to sit in their presence. James remained standing. "I'll stand, sir, if it's all the same." Lafayette studied him with aristocratic curiosity, the way a natural scientist might examine an interesting specimen. But there was something else in his gaze, too. A genuine interest, a recognition of personhood that James rarely encountered. "Your master tells me you're intelligent and capable of discretion," Lafayette began, his French accent softening the harsh edges of English. "I need to determine if that assessment is accurate. I do what I'm told, sir, and I don't talk about it after. That's a start, but what I need is more complicated than simple obedience." Lafayette leaned forward. "I need someone who can think independently, who can make decisions in dangerous circumstances, who can remember complex information without writing it down. Someone who can lie convincingly to people who will kill them if the lie is detected." James felt his heartbeat accelerate but kept his face neutral. "Sounds dangerous, sir. Extremely. You would go into British camps pretending to be a runaway seeking freedom under their proclamations. You would work for them, serve them, gain their trust, and you would observe everything. Troop strengths, fortification positions, supply situations, officer conversations, strategic discussions. You would memorize these observations and report them back to me through a network of contacts. And if they catch me, they will hang you. Spies are not afforded prisoner of war status. There will be no trial, no exchange, no mercy. Lafayette's voice was matter-of-fact, not cruel, but honest. I will not lie to you about the risks. James absorbed this, his mind working through implications. And if I refuse, then you return to your master and continue your life as it has been. I will not force you into this. Lafayette paused. Though I should mention that your master has already agreed to your service. Refusing me might create difficulties with him. So it was a choice that wasn't really a choice. The story of James's entire life. He could volunteer for this dangerous mission or face his master's anger for refusing to support the revolutionary cause. But Lafayette's honesty about the dangers, his directness about the lack of real choice was more respectful than the usual pretense. If I do this, James said carefully, and we win the war, will I be free? Lafayette's expression became complicated. I don't have the legal authority to free you. That's your master's decision or the legislators. But I will personally advocate for your freedom. I will document your service, testify to your contributions, and use whatever influence I possess. But you can't promise. No, I cannot promise. At least it was honest. James had lived long enough to know that white men's promises to black people were usually worthless. But Lafayette's refusal to make guarantees he couldn't keep was in its own way more trustworthy than easy assurances would have been. James thought about his mother's advice. Keep your mind hidden. Use it to survive. This was a chance to use his mind for something more than mere survival. To be part of something significant even if his contribution would never be acknowledged. I'll do it, he said. Lafayette nodded, something like respect showing in his eyes. Then we have much to discuss. Sit down, James. We need to prepare you and we don't have much time. The next 5 days transformed James from a plantation slave into a covert operative. Lafayette assigned him to a Continental Intelligence officer named Captain Benjamin Haynes, a lean Penian with eyes that seemed to catalog everything and a manner that suggested he trusted no one fully. Haynes had run intelligence operations throughout the war. He understood the mechanics of espionage, the practical details that meant the difference between successful intelligence gathering and execution. They worked in a small tent on the encampment's perimeter, away from casual observation. Haynes began with fundamentals. First rule, you are always performing. From the moment you approach British lines until the moment you return to ours, you are playing a character. That character is not you, it's a version of you. Simplified, less intelligent than you actually are, more grateful for British attention, more eager to please. You understand? James nodded. Make myself seem harmless. Exactly. The British expect runaway slaves to be desperate, grateful, and simple. Give them what they expect. Never let them see you thinking too hard, analyzing too carefully. You're not stupid. That would be suspicious, but you're not clever either. You're competent enough to follow orders and do basic work, but not someone who would understand military strategy or remember detailed information. They practiced conversation scenarios. Haynes would play a British officer, questioning James about his background, his reasons for running, his knowledge of the area. James learned to answer in ways that seemed spontaneous but were actually carefully crafted, mixing truth with strategic omissions, providing useful information about the local area without revealing too much intelligence. Where are you from? Armistead Plantation, sir, in New Kent County. Master William Armistead. Why did you run? Master was talking about selling some of us to pay debts, sir. I heard the British would give freedom to folks who came over. Figured I'd rather take my chances with that than get sold to some Georgia plantation. You know the roads around here? Yes, sir. Run errands between plantations before. Know the main roads, some of the smaller paths. You ever see Continental soldiers in the area? Sometimes, sir. They came through a few weeks back. Took some supplies from the plantations. Master was angry about it. It sounded natural, unrehearsed. That was the key. Sounding spontaneous while actually following a script, providing information that seemed helpful, but was actually designed to build credibility without revealing anything truly valuable. Haynes taught him memory techniques, how to organize observations mentally so they could be recalled accurately later, how to count large groups without obviously counting, how to estimate distances, assess fortification strength, identify different types of artillery by their appearance. You can't write anything down. Haynes emphasized written notes or evidence that will get you killed. Everything has to be in your head. When you observe something important, mentally file it away with associated details. If you see a supply wagon arriving, note the time of day, what was being unloaded, how many men were unloading it, where it came from. If you overhear conversation, they practiced with camp observations. Haynes would walk James through the Continental encampment, then quiz him hours later about what he had seen, how many tents in the medical area, what types of weapons were being cleaned in the armory section, how many horses in the cavalry picket. At first, James struggled to retain the volume of detail, but his mind adapted quickly. He developed systems associating information with physical locations, creating mental images that encoded multiple data points, organizing observations into categories that made recall easier. By the third day, he was retaining information with impressive accuracy. Haynes tested him with increasingly complex scenarios, introducing distractions and interruptions, simulating the confusion of real intelligence gathering. British officer asks you a question while you're hauling supplies and you're tired and distracted. You have to answer immediately without seeming to think too hard. Practice. They also prepared his cover story in exhaustive detail. Every element had to be consistent, memorable, and impossible to easily verify. James would claim to have run from the Armistead plantation seeking British freedom. His knowledge of the plantation, the area, and local conditions was genuine. That couldn't be faked. But they crafted specific details about his alleged treatment, his motivations, his hopes for British freedom that would make him seem genuine to enemy interrogators. They might test you, Haynes warned. British intelligence officers are not fools. They'll ask you questions designed to catch inconsistencies. They'll bring you back hours or days later and ask the same question slightly differently to see if your story changes. You need to be able to maintain your cover under pressure. They practiced interrogation scenarios. Haynes would pepper James with questions, circle back to previous topics, try to catch him in contradictions. It was exhausting, mentally demanding in ways that physical labor never had been. But James discovered something about himself during this training. He was good at this. Years of reading white people's moods, of anticipating their expectations, of concealing his true thoughts behind a mask of submission. All of that had been training for exactly this kind of work. He had been preparing for espionage his entire life without knowing it. On the fourth day, Lafayette joined them to assess James's readiness. The French general questioned him about his cover story, tested his memory retention, probed for psychological readiness. "Are you afraid?" Lafayette asked bluntly. "Yes, sir." "Good. Fear keeps you careful. Overconfidence gets spies killed." Lafayette paused. "Are you committed to this? I need to know you won't lose your nerve when you're inside British lines with no way out." James met his eyes directly, breaking the usual slave protocol. "I spent 20 years as property, sir. I've been afraid every day of my life. This is just a different kind of fear, and at least this time I choose to face it." Lafayette nodded slowly. "Captain Haynes, is he ready?" Haynes considered the question carefully. "As ready as anyone can be for this. He's smart, he's careful, he's motivated. Whether he can actually pull it off under real conditions," he shrugged, "we won't know until he tries." "Then we proceed," Lafayette decided. "James, you'll leave tomorrow at first light. Captain Haynes will brief you on your contact network and exfiltration procedures. Once you cross into British territory, you're on your own. We cannot help you if things go wrong." That night, James lay awake in a tent provided by the Continental Army, staring at canvas and wondering if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. He thought about his mother, about her advice to keep his mind hidden. He was about to do the opposite, to use his mind as a weapon, to risk everything on his ability to think clearly under impossible pressure. But he had made his choice. And in the morning, he would become someone else entirely. The road to Portsmouth stretched through Virginia countryside that looked deceptively peaceful. Spring was asserting itself, trees budding, wildflowers emerging, birds returning from southern migrations. If you didn't look too closely at the burned plantations and abandoned farms, you could almost forget there was a war. James walked alone, carrying nothing except the clothes on his back and a story in his head. Captain Haynes had given him final instructions that morning. Approach British pickets near Portsmouth. Present himself as a runaway. Stick to the prepared cover story and wait for opportunities to gather intelligence. Don't try to learn everything at once. Haynes had warned, establish yourself first, gain trust, blend in. Intelligence gathering is patient work. The walk took most of the day. James passed other travelers on the road, refugees fleeing the fighting, farmers trying to maintain some semblance of normal life, occasional military patrols. He drew little attention. A young black man walking alone wasn't unusual in 1781 Virginia. Enslaved people ran errands, carried messages, moved between plantations. As long as he didn't act suspicious, most people would ignore him. Late afternoon brought him to the British perimeter. Portsmouth had been occupied for weeks, transformed into a fortified military base. Earthworks and palisades surrounded the town. Sentries manned checkpoints on all approach roads. The red coats of British regulars were visible everywhere, along with the blue and green coats of Hessian mercenaries and the varied dress of loyalist militia. James approached a checkpoint with his heart hammering, but his face carefully arranged in an expression of nervous hope. Two British soldiers stood guard, experienced regulars with the weathered look of men who had been campaigning for years. "Stop there," one of them commanded. "State your business." James stopped, adopting a posture of submission. "I'm seeking to join His Majesty's forces, sir. I'm a runaway from a rebel plantation. I heard the British would give freedom to slaves who come over." The soldiers exchanged glances. They had clearly processed dozens of similar arrivals. "Another one," the first soldier muttered. To James, "Where you from?" "Armistead Plantation, New Kent County, sir." "Why now? Why not run earlier?" "Master was talking about selling some of us to cover debts, sir. I figured I'd rather take my chances with British freedom than end up on some Georgia plantation where they work you to death." One soldier nodded. The explanation was believable, common. "You got skills. Can you work?" "Field work, sir. Strong back. I can handle horses, do basic carpentry, follow orders. I'm a good worker. Can you read?" "No, sir." "Good." The soldier gestured toward the town. "Report to the quartermaster's depot inside the main gates. They'll process you, assign you work. You cause trouble, you'll regret it. You work hard, you'll get fed and have a chance at freedom when this is over. Understood?" "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The soldiers waved him through, already losing interest. James walked through the checkpoint, and just like that, he was inside British lines. Portsmouth was a chaotic military city. Thousands of soldiers from multiple armies, British regulars, German mercenaries, loyalist Americans occupied every available space. Warehouses had been converted to barracks. Private homes housed officers. Enslaved people who had fled to British lines performed labor throughout the town, unloading supply ships at the docks, constructing fortifications, cooking, cleaning, maintaining equipment. James found the Quartermaster's depot, a large warehouse buzzing with activity. A harried sergeant processed new arrivals with bureaucratic efficiency. James waited in line behind three other recently arrived runaways, listening to their stories. Most were similar to his own, people fleeing harsh conditions, seeking the freedom that British proclamations promised. When his turn came, the sergeant asked perfunctory questions while filling out a form. "Name, James, sir?" "Last name?" "Just James, sir. Slaves don't have last names mostly." "Previous master, William Armistead, New Kent County. Skills, fieldwork, basic carpentry, horse handling, literacy?" "No, sir." The sergeant nodded, made notations, assigned James a number for tracking purposes. "You'll work with construction crews reinforcing fortifications. Report to Sergeant Welsh at the North Earthworks tomorrow morning at dawn. You'll be housed in the laborers' quarters near the docks. Any questions?" "No, sir." "Thank you, sir." Next. And that was it. James had infiltrated British headquarters with nothing more than a plausible story and a submissive demeanor. No one suspected him because why would they? He was exactly what he appeared to be, another escaped slave seeking British freedom, grateful and compliant. The laborers' quarters were a converted tobacco warehouse now housing roughly 200 black men and women who had fled to British lines. Crude bunks lined the walls. The air smelled of too many humans in too little space. But compared to slave cabins on plantations, it was actually somewhat better. The British fed their workers adequately, understanding that labor required fuel. James found an empty bunk and settled in, listening to conversations around him. People shared their stories, where they had come from, what they had fled, their hopes for the future. Some were optimistic, believing British promises of freedom. Others were more cynical, suspecting they had simply traded one form of bondage for another. A man in the next bunk introduced himself as Samuel, originally from a plantation near Williamsburg. He had been with the British for 2 months. "They treat you decent mostly," Samuel said. "Works hard, but they feed you regular, and the overseers don't beat you like plantation overseers do. Some of the officers are bastards, but some are actually respectful. It's strange, you know, being called by your name, not just boy or worse." "You think they'll really give us freedom?" James asked, playing his role as a naive newcomer. Samuel shrugged. "I think they'll give us freedom as long as it helps them win the war. What happens after? I don't know, but it's got to be better than what we left behind." James filed the information away. The attitudes of other runaways, their levels of trust in British promises, their observations about how the occupation worked. Every piece of information was potentially valuable. That night, lying in the dark warehouse, listening to the sounds of hundreds of people sleeping, coughing, shifting, James allowed himself to acknowledge the fear he had been suppressing all day. He was deep inside enemy territory now, surrounded by soldiers who would kill him without hesitation if they discovered his true purpose. But he had made it through the first day. His cover was established. Now the real work would begin. The next 6 weeks were the most intense education of James's life. He worked construction during the day, hauling materials, digging trenches, reinforcing earthworks, while observing everything with the careful attention Captain Haynes had trained into him. He learned the rhythm of the British military machine, morning formations at dawn with drums calling soldiers to attention, breakfast routines that varied by unit. British regulars received better rations than loyalist militia. Hessian mercenaries had their own supply systems. Work details organized by type, construction crews, dock workers, maintenance teams, evening formations, guard rotations, nighttime security protocols. He memorized the layout of Portsmouth's fortifications, mentally mapping defensive positions, counting artillery pieces, noting fields of fire and vulnerable approaches. The British were building Portsmouth into a fortress, clearly intending to hold it as a permanent base for operations in Virginia. Supply ships arrived regularly from New York, unloading equipment, ammunition, food, replacement soldiers. James worked dock details frequently, giving him opportunities to observe what was being delivered and in what quantities. A sudden increase in artillery ammunition suggested preparations for a campaign. Medical supplies arriving in bulk might indicate expectations of casualties. Every detail told part of a larger story, but the most valuable intelligence came from simply listening. British soldiers talked freely around enslaved laborers, not considering that these simple workers might understand the significance of what was being discussed. Officers conversed in front of James as if he were furniture, discussing troop movement, supply problems, strategic frustrations. He heard complaints about ammunition shortages, discussions about tensions between British regulars and Hessian mercenaries, speculation about when Lord Cornwallis would arrive to take supreme command in Virginia, frustration that the Royal Navy couldn't adequately patrol all of Virginia's waterways against continental harassment. Every conversation was a piece of intelligence. James filed them all away in his carefully organized mental catalog, waiting for the opportunity to report. The contact system Captain Haynes had established was ingenious in its simplicity. Every week, James would volunteer for work details that took him outside Portsmouth's immediate fortifications, collecting firewood, foraging supplies, delivering messages to outlying pickets. During these excursions, he would make brief contact with Continental sympathizers who moved through the countryside as farmers, traders, or travelers. The contacts changed regularly to avoid establishing patterns. One week, it might be a free black man operating a small farm who would engage James in casual conversation while passing along a prearranged signal. The next week, a white farmer's wife buying supplies at a market where James's work detail happened to stop. Each contact had been carefully vetted by Continental intelligence. Each knew only enough to fulfill their specific role. James would deliver his intelligence verbally, speaking quickly and precisely while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. The contact would memorize the information, or in some cases discreetly write it down for later transmission, and James would return to Portsmouth with no one aware that anything significant had occurred. After 3 weeks, he had delivered intelligence on British troop strength, approximately 4,000 regulars, 2,000 militia, 800 Hessians, fortification plans, supply schedules, and officer dynamics. Lafayette received the information with growing appreciation. His spy was exceeding all expectations. But James was about to become even more valuable. General Lord Charles Cornwallis arrived in Portsmouth on May 20, 1781, and the entire British operation in Virginia transformed. Cornwallis was Britain's most experienced general in America, a professional soldier who had fought in Europe and India, a man who understood war as a science rather than a romantic adventure. He was also deeply frustrated. For 6 years, Britain had been fighting an enemy that refused to fight conventionally. The Continental Army avoided decisive battles, harassed supply lines, melted into the countryside when pressed. It was guerrilla warfare conducted by an enemy that seemed to have infinite patience and unlimited space to retreat into. Cornwallis intended to change that. His strategy was to establish a permanent British presence in Virginia, the heart of the rebellion, home to many revolutionary leaders, and use it as a base to finally crush continental resistance. Port South would become his fortress from which he could project power throughout the region. His arrival brought immediate changes. Discipline tightened, fortification work accelerated, patrols intensified. The entire British presence became more organized, more efficient, more dangerous. And Cornwallis brought with him a professional intelligence apparatus. Captain Richard Durham was Cornwallis's intelligence officer, a veteran of multiple campaigns who understood that information won wars as surely as battlefield tactics. He was in his late 30s, lean and sharp-eyed with the manner of someone who trusted no one and suspected everyone. Durham's first action was to review existing intelligence-gathering operations. He questioned officers about local informants, examined reports about continental positions, assessed the reliability of information sources, and he recognized a significant gap. The British had plenty of information from loyalist civilians about continental movements outside British-controlled territory, but relatively little intelligence about continental intentions, capabilities, and leadership thinking. What Durham needed was someone who could infiltrate continental lines, gather information, and return safely. He needed a spy. He began interviewing the enslaved laborers who had fled to British lines, looking for candidates with the right combination of intelligence, local knowledge, and motivation. Most were unsuitable, too obviously intelligent, which would make continental officers suspicious, or too simple, which would limit their ability to gather useful information. But one interview stood out. James had been working on fortification construction for 6 weeks when he was pulled aside by a sergeant and told to report to Captain Durham's office. He felt a spike of fear. Had something gone wrong? Had someone become suspicious, but kept his face neutral as he walked to the requisitioned house that served as British intelligence headquarters. Durham received him in a small office that smelled of pipe tobacco and paper. The intelligence officer studied James with the careful attention of someone who made a profession of reading people. "Sit down." James sat, keeping his posture submissive but not cringing. "You're James. Came over from Armistead plantation 6 weeks ago." "Yes, sir. You've been a good worker. Supervisors say you follow orders, don't cause trouble. Seem grateful for the opportunity to serve His Majesty." "I am grateful, sir. Better than being sold to Georgia." Durham lit his pipe, using the action to study James's face. "You know this area well? The roads, the plantations, the terrain?" "Yes, sir. Lived here my whole life. Ran errands between plantations before the war." "You ever see Continental soldiers?" "Sometimes, sir, when they'd pass through the area. What did you think of them?" It was a test question. Assessing James's attitudes, he answered carefully. "Didn't think much about them, sir. Masters talked about politics, but that wasn't my concern. I just tried to stay out of trouble." Durham nodded, apparently satisfied. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Would you be willing to return to rebel-controlled territory to gather information for His Majesty's forces?" James felt his heart race, but showed only confused curiosity. "Return there, sir. How you'd approach continental lines with a story. Maybe that the British weren't what you hoped. Maybe that you want to return to familiar territory. Maybe something else. You'd gain their trust, observe their positions and plans, then return here with information." Durham watched him carefully. It would be dangerous. If they suspected you, they'd hang you as a spy, but it would strike a blow against the rebels who kept you enslaved. James pretended to think about this, letting concern show on his face. "I don't know, sir. That sounds dangerous. What if they recognize me?" "No, I ran to the British. That's why it works. They'd expect a runaway to be conflicted, possibly wanting to return. Your honesty about your situation would make you credible." Durham leaned forward. "Think about it. The rebels talk about freedom while keeping people like you in chains. The British are actually offering you a chance at liberty. Don't you want to strike back at the system that enslaved you?" It was the perfect appeal, and James responded to it with exactly the right mixture of reluctance and growing willingness. "If you think I can help, sir, if it means helping win the war and getting my freedom, I suppose I could try." Durham smiled, satisfied. "Good man. We'll prepare you carefully. This is important work, James. His Majesty will remember your service." And just like that, James Armistead became a double agent. Operating as a double agent required mental gymnastics that exhausted James in ways physical labor never had. He was now maintaining 3 separate identities simultaneously. First, his surface identity as James, the grateful runaway working for the British, simple and loyal. Second, his persona as a potential spy for the British, being trained by Durham to gather continental intelligence, still playing simple and grateful, but showing slightly more capability. Third, his actual identity as Lafayette's operative, using his British assignments as cover to gather information about British operations while feeding carefully crafted misinformation back to Durham. Durham spent 2 weeks training James for his mission. The British intelligence officer taught him what to look for: continental troop strengths, artillery positions, supply situations, officer morale. He taught him how to ask questions without seeming obvious, how to remember details, how to maintain his cover. James absorbed the training while carefully noting everything Durham taught him. The training methods themselves were intelligence. They revealed what the British considered important, what gaps existed in their knowledge, what assumptions guided their intelligence gathering. Durham also prepared false intelligence for James to discover and report back. This was standard counterintelligence practice, feeding your spy information you want the enemy to believe, then having the spy leak it as if revealing secrets. But James understood exactly what was happening. He mentally categorized the false information Durham wanted planted, knowing he would need to report it to Lafayette's handlers so they could assess British intentions. In mid-June, Durham decided James was ready. They crafted a cover story. James would claim he had left the British because conditions weren't what he'd hoped, that he missed familiar territory, that he wanted to try returning to the Armistead plantation to see if he could avoid punishment. It was psychologically plausible. Homesickness and regret were common among runaways. "When you reach continental lines, they'll question you," Durham instructed. "Be honest about coming from us. Lying about that would be immediately suspicious. Say you're disillusioned, that you realize the rebels might win, and you want to be on the winning side. Show them you understand the area, that you can be useful. Then observe everything and return within 2 weeks." "Yes, sir, I'll do my best." Durham handed him a pass that would get him through British picket lines. "Good luck, James. His Majesty's cause depends on men like you." James left Portsmouth on a June morning, walking the same road he had approached from 2 months earlier. But this time he was carrying 2 sets of intelligence, genuine British information for Lafayette, and false information Durham wanted fed to Continental Command. The complexity was staggering. He had to remember what the British thought he believed, what he actually knew, what he was supposed to report, and what he needed to genuinely report. A single mistake, a moment of confusion that led to contradictory information could expose him to either side. He reached Continental lines by midday. American sentries stopped him, and he gave his prepared story. He had run to the British seeking freedom, found conditions there difficult, was now seeking to return to familiar territory, and perhaps be useful to the Continental cause. The sentries were immediately suspicious. A black man coming from British lines could be a genuine defector or a British spy. They held him under guard while sending word up the chain of command. Within hours, James was being questioned by Continental intelligence officers. They interrogated him for the entire afternoon. Where had he been? What had he seen? Why was he returning? What did he know about British positions? James answered carefully, mixing truth with strategic omissions. Yes, he had been in Portsmouth. Yes, he had worked for the British. Yes, he had seen their fortifications and troop positions. He described what he had observed, providing accurate intelligence that proved his credibility, but he didn't mention Lafayette or his previous spy work. That information was compartmentalized. Only specific Continental officers knew about his mission, and he couldn't reveal it to these interrogators without proper authentication. Finally, one of the officers said something that contained a recognition phrase Captain Haynes had taught him. "You seem like someone who pays attention to details." James responded with the counterphrase, "My mother always said noticing things kept you alive." The officer's demeanor immediately changed. "Wait here." An hour later, James was taken to a private tent and reunited with Captain Haynes. The intelligence officer embraced him briefly, a rare expression of warmth. "Welcome back. We were starting to worry." "Durham recruited you." "Yes, sir. Trained me for 2 weeks. Sent me here to gather intelligence on your positions." Haynes grinned. "Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Now we can feed them exactly what we want them to believe while you gather genuine intelligence from inside their command structure." They spent the next several hours debriefing. James reported everything he had learned during his time in Portsmouth. Troop strengths, fortification layouts, supply schedules, officer dynamics, Durham's intelligence priorities. He also reported the false information Durham had given him to plant with Continental Command. Haynes took careful notes, already planning how to use this intelligence. "You'll stay here for a week. We'll carefully craft information for you to take back to Durham, mostly accurate, but with strategic distortions. Then you return to Portsmouth, report your intelligence, and continue the cycle." "They'll test me, sir." Durham will ask questions designed to catch inconsistencies. I know. That's why we'll prepare your report meticulously. Every detail has to be consistent, verifiable where possible, but misleading in aggregate. For the next week, James worked with Continental intelligence officers to prepare his false report. They gave him information about Continental positions, mostly accurate in detail but strategically misleading in implication. Troop strengths were exaggerated. Artillery positions were slightly mislocated. Supply situations were described as better than they actually were. The goal was to make the British believe Lafayette's forces were stronger and better positioned than reality, which would make Cornwallis more cautious, possibly causing him to miss offensive opportunities. But preparing this information required James to memorize yet another version of reality. He now had to remember what the British had told him to look for, what he had actually seen, what he was reporting to Durham, and what the truth actually was. 4 different versions of reality had to coexist in his mind without getting confused. Lafayette met with him before he returned to British lines. The French general looked tired. Weeks of maneuvering against superior British forces had worn on him, but he managed to smile when he saw James. Captain Haynes tells me you've done extraordinary work. Durham trusts you completely. For now, sir, but how long can I keep this up? Every time I cross lines, every conversation, every report, one mistake, and I'm dead. Lafayette's expression became serious. I know what I'm asking of you. No one would blame you for refusing to continue. But the intelligence you're providing is invaluable. You're giving us eyes inside Cornwallis's headquarters. That advantage could win us this campaign. James thought about his mother, about the promise of freedom, about the possibility that this desperate gamble might actually mean something. I'll continue, sir, but I need to know. If we win, will my service be remembered? Will it count toward my freedom? I swear to you, on my honor as a French nobleman, I will do everything in my power to secure your freedom. I will document your service, testify before any authority necessary, use every bit of influence I possess. Lafayette gripped his shoulder. You have my word. It would have to be enough. James returned to British lines the next day, carrying intelligence that was simultaneously true and false, playing a role that was simultaneously sincere and deceptive. The double game had truly begun. The next 2 months, July and August 1781, were the most dangerous period of James's life. He crossed between Continental and British lines 6 more times, each journey carrying the risk of exposure, capture, or death. The routine became grimly familiar. He would spend 10 days to 2 weeks with the British, working and observing, gathering intelligence while feeding Durham carefully prepared reports about Continental positions. Then he would request permission to return to rebel territory under various pretexts, checking on family, seeking additional intelligence, maintaining his cover as someone conflicted about which side to support. Durham would brief him on what to look for, sometimes giving him specific questions to answer. Where was Lafayette positioning his artillery? What were Continental supply situations? Were reinforcements arriving from the north? Each question revealed British intelligence priorities and gaps. James would cross to Continental lines, undergo debriefing with Haynes, deliver his genuine British intelligence, and receive carefully crafted false information to report back. Then he would return to Portsmouth, deliver his false report, and begin the cycle again. The strain was enormous. He had to remember not just information, but the context of information. What he was supposed to have observed versus what he had actually seen, what Durham expected to hear versus what would be credible, what the British believed versus what Continental officers knew. Several times he came dangerously close to exposure. Once Durham questioned him about Continental artillery positions. James provided the false information he had been given, 6 cannon on a ridge east of Lafayette's encampment. But then Durham produced a report from a loyalist scout that contradicted his information. This scout says there are no cannon on that ridge. Either you're lying or you're mistaken or he's incompetent. James's mind raced, searching for an explanation that would preserve his cover. Sir, I saw supply wagons moving toward that ridge and heard soldiers talking about artillery placement. But maybe they were moving the cannon, not positioning them there. Or maybe the scout observed a different ridge. Durham stared at him for a long moment. James kept his breathing steady, his expression confused and worried. A simple man concerned he'd made a mistake, not a spy caught in a lie. Finally, Durham nodded. Possibly. The rebels do move their positions frequently. Be more careful about your observations. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. Another time, a British officer who had previously interrogated James stopped him in Portsmouth and asked casual questions about his background. The questions seemed friendly, conversational, but James recognized them as an intelligence test, verifying his story against previous statements. You said you came from Armistead plantation, right? Yes, sir. How many slaves on that plantation? James had never mentioned the specific number before, but giving a vague answer now would be suspicious. A man who grew up on a plantation would know roughly how many people lived there. Around 60, sir. Maybe a few more or less depending on births and who gets sold. And you work the tobacco fields? Yes, sir. Tobacco, mostly some corn. Your master, William Armistead? He married? Yes, sir. Mrs. Armistead, and they got 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The officer nodded, apparently satisfied, but James's hands were shaking slightly as he walked away. These casual interrogations were designed to catch spies who had memorized prepared stories but lacked genuine knowledge. One wrong answer about verifiable details could unravel everything. The psychological toll was immense. James began having nightmares, confused dreams where he couldn't remember which side he was supposed to be working for, where officers from both armies questioned him simultaneously, where he stood on a gallows watching himself hang. He lost weight despite adequate food. His hands developed a slight tremor. The mask of submission he wore became harder to maintain because underneath it he was exhausted, terrified, stretched beyond any reasonable human limit. But he continued because the intelligence he was providing was changing the war. Lafayette used James's information to avoid British traps to position his forces advantageously to strike at vulnerable supply lines. Cornwallis, receiving false intelligence through Durham's spy network, made strategic decisions based on inaccurate information. He believed Lafayette commanded nearly twice his actual strength. He thought continental supply lines were more robust than they were. He positioned his forces to counter threats that didn't exist while leaving actual vulnerabilities exposed. In late July, James overheard a conversation between Cornwallis and his senior officers that would prove decisive. They were discussing where to establish a permanent British base in Virginia. Cornwallis wanted a deep water port with naval access, strong defensive positions, and proximity to interior supply lines. Yorktown. Cornwallis decided studying a map. The York River provides naval access. The terrain is defensible, and we can fortify it sufficiently to hold against anything Lafayette can bring against us. James memorized every word of the conversation, understanding he had just learned Britain's strategic center of gravity in Virginia. He reported it to Haynes within 3 days. The intelligence officer immediately recognized the significance. If Cornwallis concentrates at Yorktown and fortifies it, he's making himself vulnerable to siege warfare. If we can block his naval escape route and bring enough forces to surround him. Haynes didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. The intelligence was forwarded to Lafayette, who sent it north to General Washington. The seeds of the Yorktown campaign were being planted, and James Armistead was the gardener. But he couldn't see the larger picture. He only knew that he was walking a blood's edge, that every day might be his last, that the weight of secrets he carried was crushing him. In mid-August, something broke inside him. He was in Portsmouth working a construction detail when he saw another hanging, a woman this time, an enslaved person who had tried to escape British lines and been caught. The British made it a public execution as a warning. James watched her die, and something in him fractured. That could be him. Would be him eventually, because no one could maintain this deception indefinitely. Sooner or later he would make a mistake, contradict himself, be caught in a lie, and then he would hang just like her, and no one would remember his name or his service. That night he met his continental contact, a free black farmer who operated a small plot outside Portsmouth. James delivered his intelligence report mechanically, his voice flat. "You all right?" the contact asked, concerned. "No, I'm not all right. I'm tired, I'm terrified, and I don't know how much longer I can do this. The general needs you, just a bit longer. Everyone keeps saying that. Just a bit longer, just one more crossing, just one more report." James's voice was harsh with suppressed emotion. "When does it end? When do I get to stop being terrified every single moment?" The contact had no answer. He clasped James's shoulder briefly, a gesture of solidarity and sympathy, then disappeared into the darkness. James walked back to Portsmouth alone, understanding that he was trapped in the role he had accepted. He couldn't stop now without abandoning the mission, without wasting all the risk and suffering he had already endured. He was committed whether he wanted to be or not. All he could do was survive one more day and then another and hope that eventually the war would end before his luck ran out. What James didn't know, what he couldn't know because the information was compartmentalized at the highest levels of command, was that his intelligence was enabling one of the most audacious military operations of the war. General George Washington, commanding Continental forces in New York, had been planning a massive assault on British-held New York City. But the intelligence coming from Virginia, from Lafayette's network, primarily from James, revealed an extraordinary opportunity. Cornwallis was concentrating British forces at Yorktown. He was fortifying the position, clearly intending to make it his permanent base. If the French fleet could achieve temporary naval superiority in Chesapeake Bay, cutting off Cornwallis's sea escape route, and if American and French armies could march south quickly enough to surround him before British reinforcements arrived, the British general could be trapped. It was a massive gamble. Washington would have to march his army nearly 500 kilometers south, maintaining secrecy to prevent the British in New York from following or warning Cornwallis. The French fleet commanded by Admiral de Grasse would have to sail from the Caribbean at exactly the right time to intercept British naval forces, and Lafayette's small army in Virginia would have to contain Cornwallis without revealing their weakness until the trap could be sprung. Everything depended on timing, secrecy, and accurate intelligence. James provided the latter. Throughout August, he continued reporting on British fortification work at Yorktown, on Cornwallis's troop dispositions, on supply situations, on naval schedules. Each piece of intelligence helped Washington and his French allies refine their plan. Meanwhile, James fed Durham false information that reinforced British confidence. He reported that Lafayette was considering withdrawing northward to join Washington. He reported continental supply problems and low morale. He reported that French naval forces were concentrating in the Caribbean, not sailing toward Virginia. Durham believed it all because James had established credibility through accurate reports about verifiable details. The British intelligence officer trusted his spy completely, never suspecting that every strategic assessment was carefully crafted to mislead British command. In late August, Washington's army began its march south. To maintain deception, they created the appearance of preparing to attack New York, then suddenly pivoted south, moving with speed that surprised even Continental officers. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse departed the Caribbean, sailing north toward Chesapeake Bay. Lafayette's forces in Virginia began carefully maneuvering to block Cornwallis's escape routes while appearing to avoid direct confrontation. The trap was closing and Cornwallis didn't see it. James, still moving between camps, gathering intelligence, feeding misinformation, had no idea that his work was enabling a decisive campaign. He only knew that Durham's questions were becoming more urgent, more specific, that British officers seemed increasingly concerned about continental movements. On September 2nd, something changed dramatically. James was in Portsmouth when word spread through British ranks. A massive French fleet had arrived in Chesapeake Bay, engaging British naval forces. The Battle of the Chesapeake lasted 5 days. The French fleet, superior in numbers and position, drove off British naval forces, establishing temporary control of the bay. Cornwallis's sea escape route was cut. Panic rippled through British officers. Without naval superiority, they were vulnerable. But Cornwallis remained confident in his fortifications. Yorktown was defensible against anything Lafayette could bring against him. Except it wasn't just Lafayette anymore. On September 14th, advanced elements of Washington's army arrived from the north. On September 26th, the combined American and French forces, nearly 20,000 soldiers, surrounded Yorktown. Cornwallis was trapped in a siege with roughly 8,000 defenders facing an enemy 3 times his size. With no escape route and no realistic hope of relief, James found himself trapped inside the siege. Unable to cross lines anymore, his work as a double agent ended abruptly, replaced by the immediate danger of living inside a besieged fortress being pounded by artillery. The siege of Yorktown transformed the town into a vision of hell that would haunt James for the rest of his life. Though he had been trained to avoid graphic details, the sheer scale of suffering around him was inescapable. The bombardment began on October 9, 1781. American and French artillery positions, carefully established over the previous 2 weeks, opened fire with devastating effect. The sound was constant, overwhelming, a thunder that made thought difficult and sleep impossible. James worked with other laborers trying to reinforce fortifications that crumbled as fast as they could repair them. Cannonballs tore through earthworks, exploded positions, collapsed buildings. The wounded were carried to overwhelmed medical tents where surgeons worked with desperate efficiency. Food rations decreased as supplies dwindled. What had been adequate meals became sparse portions. Then those portions shrank further. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Disease spread through crowded quarters. Dysentery, typhus, the inevitable result of too many people in too little space with inadequate sanitation. British morale collapsed in stages. First came angry defiance. They were professional soldiers they would hold. Then came determination. The situation was difficult, but they had faced worse. Then came desperation. Where were the relief forces? Why wasn't the Royal Navy breaking through the French blockade? Finally came resignation. They were going to lose. It was just a question of when. Durham, the intelligence officer who had trained James, moved through the chaos with grim efficiency. He no longer questioned James about continental positions. There was no point. They were surrounded completely. Instead, he focused on maintaining internal security, watching for deserters, trying to maintain some semblance of order. He stopped James one afternoon during a brief pause in the bombardment. "This is your fault," Durham said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Not you personally. But the intelligence we received from our sources was wrong. We thought Lafayette was weak, undersupplied, possibly withdrawing. Instead, he was stalling until reinforcements arrived. Someone fed us false information." James kept his face carefully neutral, showing only confused sympathy. "I don't understand these things, sir. I just reported what I saw." Durham stared at him for a long moment, suspicion and resignation warring in his expression. But what did it matter now? They were trapped regardless of how they got there. "Get back to work," Durham said, walking away. James wondered if the intelligence officer suspected him specifically, or was simply recognizing that British intelligence had been compromised generally. Either way, there was nothing Durham could do about it now. On October 14th, Continental forces stormed two key redoubts in a nighttime assault. James watched from a distance as soldiers with bayonets overwhelmed British positions through sheer determination and numerical superiority. The defensive perimeter contracted further. The end was obvious now. Cornwallis attempted a desperate breakout on October 16th, trying to evacuate his forces across the York River to Gloucester Point, but weather and continental vigilance made it impossible. Half his forces were trapped on the wrong side of the river. The boats were inadequate. The attempt collapsed into confused retreat. On October 17th, a British drummer appeared on the parapet playing a particular rhythm, the signal for parley. An officer appeared waving a white flag. The guns fell silent. The siege was over. The formal surrender took place on October 19th, 1781, with all the ceremony military protocol demanded. British soldiers marched out of Yorktown in formation, their uniforms still immaculate despite weeks of siege, and laid down their weapons in neat rows. Officers surrendered their swords to American counterparts. Military bands played, flags were furled, the ritual of defeat was performed with precise formality. James stood among the crowds of enslaved laborers, watching history pivot on this moment. He had helped engineer this defeat. His intelligence, his risk, his months of walking between armies had contributed to this outcome. Cornwallis's surrender effectively ended major military operations in the Revolutionary War. British public support for continuing the conflict would collapse. Independence for the American colonies was now inevitable, and James stood in the crowd as property, anonymous and unacknowledged. Continental forces occupied Yorktown methodically. Officers moved through the captured town, cataloging supplies, processing prisoners, establishing administration. The enslaved people, who had fled to British lines, found themselves in legal limbo, neither British property nor continental property, but not exactly free either. James searched desperately for Lafayette among the celebrating Continental officers. He needed to establish his status to confirm he wouldn't be mistakenly claimed as captured British property. He finally found the French general accepting congratulations from American officers, savoring the victory he had helped engineer. James approached carefully, aware he was breaking military protocol but desperate. "General Lafayette, sir?" Lafayette turned, and for a moment his face showed blank incomprehension. Then recognition dawned, followed by surprise and genuine delight. "James, my God, you survived. I feared." He cut himself off, aware of the officers around them listening with curiosity. He gripped James's shoulder warmly. "Walk with me." They moved to a quieter area, away from immediate observation. Lafayette's expression was complex, joy at seeing James alive mixed with something that looked like guilt. "Your intelligence was extraordinary," Lafayette said quietly, "absolutely vital to this victory. Captain Haynes showed me your reports throughout the campaign. You provided information that directly enabled this outcome." "Thank you, sir." James hesitated, then asked the question that had been consuming him. "And my freedom, sir? You said when the war was won." Lafayette's expression shifted, becoming uncomfortable. "James, you must understand. I don't have the legal authority to free you." You're still technically the property of William Armistead. I can testify to your service. I can advocate for your freedom. I can use whatever influence I possess with the Virginia legislature, but I cannot simply declare you free." The words hit James like physical blows. He had risked everything, had walked between armies, had lived with constant terror, had contributed to winning a war, and he was still enslaved. "But sir, you promised." "I promised to do everything in my power, and I will." Lafayette's voice was sincere, but constrained by legal reality. "I will write the most powerful testimony I can compose. I will personally petition the Virginia General Assembly. I will use every connection, every bit of political capital I possess. But the law is the law, and I cannot override it unilaterally." James felt something break inside him. Not surprise. He had always known this might be the outcome. But the death of hope is painful, even when expected. So I just go back, return to the plantation as if none of this happened for now. "But I give you my solemn word, I will fight for your freedom. This is not the end, James. It's merely more complicated than I hoped." It was all James would get. A promise, sincere but uncertain, from a man who meant well, but operated within a system built on the very bondage James had fought to escape. He returned to the Armistead plantation in late October 1781, walking the same roads he had traversed as a spy, but now returning to slavery. William Armistead received him with cautious satisfaction. The slave had served the revolutionary cause and survived, which reflected well on the master's judgment and patriotism, but nothing had fundamentally changed. James returned to tobacco fields, to the careful navigation of plantation social dynamics, to the daily reality of being property. Except everything had changed because James had changed. A man who had operated at the highest levels of military intelligence, who had outmaneuvered professional British spies, who had directly contributed to winning a war for independence, could not easily return to the psychological space of slavery. He went through the motions, working, attending church, participating in the routines of enslaved life. But part of him had died at Yorktown, when he realized that his service meant nothing to the legal structure of American society. The years that followed were perhaps harder than the months of active espionage. At least as a spy, James had purpose, urgency, the possibility of eventual recognition. In the aftermath, he had only waiting and the slow erosion of hope. Lafayette kept his promise. In 1784, he submitted a detailed letter to the Virginia General Assembly testifying to James's service. "This is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligence from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and faithfully delivered. He properly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him and appears to me entitled to every reward his situation can admit of." The letter was eloquent, specific, and signed by one of the most famous heroes of the Revolution. It should have been sufficient. The Virginia General Assembly denied James's petition for freedom. The official reasoning cited insufficient documentation and concern about setting precedents for other enslaved people claiming wartime service. The real reason was simpler. He was valuable property and Virginia's economy remained dependent on slavery. James petitioned again in 1786, denied again in 1787, denied. Each rejection was a small death. Around him, white officers who had served received land grants, pensions, public honors. Their names appeared in newspapers celebrating revolutionary heroes. Monuments were erected, histories were written. The mythology of American independence was constructed. James Armistead remained a slave. The psychological weight was crushing. He had proven his intelligence, his loyalty, his capability in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. And it meant nothing to a society that legally categorized him as 3/5 of a person for census purposes, but as complete property, for economic purposes. He married in 1786 a woman named Rosa, who was enslaved on a neighboring plantation. Their courtship had to be negotiated through their respective masters. Their wedding had no legal standing. Their children would be born into the same bondage. But they built what family life they could within the constraints of slavery. James never told Rosa the full story of his wartime service. What would be the point? Who would believe that the quiet slave working tobacco fields had once been the most effective intelligence operative in the Continental Army? Lafayette returned to France after the war. Celebrated as a hero of two revolutions, the American and the evolving French one. James followed his former commander's career through plantation gossip and occasional newspaper fragments. The aristocrat who had promised to fight for his freedom was an ocean away, caught up in European political upheavals. In 1784, Lafayette did return to Virginia briefly as part of a triumphal American tour. James learned of the visit through plantation sources but made no attempt to contact him. What would be the point? Lafayette had done what he could within legal constraints. The problem wasn't the general's willingness to help. It was the fundamental structure of American society. Years passed with the particular kind of suffering that comes from hope deferred. James worked the fields, raised his children, attended religious services where preachers spoke of freedom in the next life, while ignoring bondage in this one. He watched his children grow, knowing they would inherit his status, that the service he had rendered meant nothing to their future. But Lafayette had not forgotten. In 1786, during his return to France, Lafayette learned that James remained enslaved despite his previous testimony. The French general was appalled and embarrassed. He wrote a stronger letter to the Virginia legislature, more forceful in its advocacy. I cannot but observe that I consider his services as far beyond any I have mentioned. His intelligence and conduct have been most essentially important to me. I have never seen a man I more highly esteem than James Armistead. This second letter, combined with William Armistead's supporting testimony, motivated perhaps by genuine gratitude or political opportunism or both, finally broke through Virginia's legal resistance. In January 1787, more than 5 years after Yorktown, the Virginia General Assembly granted James Armistead his freedom. The legislative act was carefully worded to make clear this was an exceptional case, not a precedent. Other enslaved people who had served the Continental cause would find their own petitions denied using various legal technicalities. But for James specifically, freedom was finally granted. He was 40 years old. The prime years of his life had been spent enslaved. The years since the war spent fighting for recognition that should have been automatic. Freedom came with conditions and limitations that James had never fully imagined during his years of fighting for it. He adopted the surname Lafayette in honor of the general who had finally helped secure his emancipation, becoming James Armistead Lafayette, a free black man in Virginia, which was a precarious status in a slave society. Free blacks existed in a legal gray zone. They weren't enslaved, but they weren't granted full citizenship either. They couldn't vote, couldn't serve on juries, couldn't testify against white people in court. They had to carry freedom papers at all times, documents proving their free status because the default assumption was that any black person was enslaved unless proven otherwise. James purchased 40 acres of land near New Kent County with money he had saved through years of hiring out his labor during what limited free time enslaved people were sometimes allowed. The land was marginal, not prime tobacco soil, but it was his. He built a small house with his own hands. He farmed his acres with fierce pride, understanding that this land represented something more than economic survival. It was proof of his humanity, his capability, his right to exist as something other than property. Rosa and their children joined him on the small farm. Their marriage, which had no legal standing while they were both enslaved, was formalized through a church ceremony. Their children were still enslaved. Freedom didn't automatically transfer to family members, but James worked to purchase them one by one, a process that took years and consumed most of his limited financial resources. He never spoke about his wartime service. Partly this was practical caution. Free blacks in Virginia had to be careful not to draw attention or seem to be claiming status above their station. But mostly it was the weight of knowing that no one would care, no one would believe, no one would remember. What was the point of telling stories about being a Revolutionary War spy when you were a black farmer barely surviving on marginal land in a society that regarded you with suspicion at best? Life settled into new routines. James farmed his acres, raised his family, attended church, navigated the complex social dynamics of being a free black man in a slave society. It was better than slavery. The ability to control his own time, to work for his own benefit, to make decisions about his life. But it was far from the freedom white Americans took for granted. The new United States of America was constructing its national identity, writing histories of the Revolution, celebrating its founding myths. The Continental Congress became enshrined as wise statesmen. Military victories became legendary. The Founding Fathers were elevated to semi-mythological status. James Armistead Lafayette did not appear in these histories. His contribution to winning the war, his vital intelligence work, his role in enabling the Yorktown victory, all of it was simply absent from the emerging narrative. This wasn't an accidental omission. It was a deliberate erasure. James's story was inconvenient to the mythology America was constructing about itself. How could you celebrate a revolutionary war fought for liberty while ignoring that one of its most effective operatives had been enslaved? How could you praise the Founding Fathers' wisdom while acknowledging that they had failed to reward one of their most valuable intelligence assets? The easiest solution was to simply forget James Armistead Lafayette existed. In 1824, Lafayette returned to America for what would be his final visit, a triumphal tour celebrating the aging hero of two revolutions. He was 67 years old, white-haired and slow-moving, but still carried himself with aristocratic bearing. Americans greeted him with overwhelming enthusiasm, staging massive parades and public celebrations in his honor. Lafayette insisted on traveling to Virginia. He had specific people he wanted to see, specific connections he wanted to renew, and one of those connections was James Armistead Lafayette. Word of Lafayette's planned visit reached James through community networks. He was 64 years old now, worn by decades of hard farming, but still alert and capable. The prospect of seeing Lafayette again stirred complex emotions: pride, bitterness, curiosity about whether the general even remembered him. The meeting was arranged in Richmond, where Lafayette was being celebrated by Virginia's political elite. James traveled there carrying the freedom papers he never went anywhere without, accompanied by two of his sons. The reunion took place in a public space which Lafayette had specifically requested. The general wanted the meeting to be witnessed, to be public, to make a statement. Lafayette saw James approaching and his face lit with genuine emotion. He crossed the distance between them quickly, embraced James warmly, and held him at arm's length to look at him. "My dear friend," Lafayette said, his voice carrying to the assembled crowd. "My dear, dear friend, I owe so much to you." James felt tears forming, the first time he had cried in decades. "General, it's good to see you, sir. Not General, not anymore. We are friends, equals. You served with intelligence and courage that exceeded any soldier I commanded. Your contribution to American independence was vital, essential." The assembled Virginia politicians and dignitaries watched this scene with varying degrees of discomfort. Lafayette was forcing them to acknowledge something they had spent decades ignoring: that a formerly enslaved black man had been a Revolutionary War hero. Lafayette spent an hour talking with James, asking about his life, his family, his farm. He spoke openly about James's intelligence work, praising it publicly, making sure witnesses heard and understood. This man was one of the finest spies in the Continental Army. Lafayette announced to the crowd, "His intelligence gathering directly contributed to our victory at Yorktown. Without him, we might have lost that campaign. Without him, American independence might have taken years longer or failed entirely." It was generous, perhaps exaggerated for effect, but coming from Lafayette, it carried weight. Local newspapers covered the reunion. Stories appeared describing the touching scene of the aging French general embracing his former spy. It was framed as a heartwarming anecdote about Lafayette's generous nature, his democratic spirit, his willingness to acknowledge contributions from unexpected sources. The stories appeared, were read over breakfast, and then were forgotten. James returned to his farm, understanding that even Lafayette's public testimony, even newspaper coverage, even documented proof of his service, none of it would fundamentally change how American society viewed him. He was a curiosity, a footnote, an interesting anomaly, not a hero to be honored alongside white revolutionary veterans, not someone whose name would appear in history textbooks, not someone whose contribution would be remembered beyond his own lifetime. James Armistead Lafayette died in August 1830 at approximately 70 years old. The exact date was not recorded with precision. Birth and death records for black people, even free ones, were often incomplete. He was buried in a churchyard near his farm, in a grave marked with a simple wooden cross that would decay within a few years. No military honors attended his burial. No newspaper obituaries celebrated his life. No monuments commemorated his service. His children and grandchildren remembered him as a good father, a hard worker, a man who had somehow secured freedom for his family. They knew vaguely that he had done something important during the war, but the details were unclear and the significance was lost on them. Within a generation, even family memory faded. His grandchildren knew he had been involved in the revolution somehow, but the specifics blurred into general folklore. By the time his great-grandchildren were adults, he was just an ancestor, notable only for having achieved freedom in a time when that was rare. The United States continued constructing its national mythology, Revolutionary War histories were written, taught in schools, enshrined in public memory. Nathan Hale, the Connecticut schoolteacher who was captured on his first intelligence mission and executed, became the legendary American spy. I only regret that I have but one life to give for my country. James Armistead Lafayette, who had conducted successful espionage operations for months, who had operated as a double agent under conditions of extreme danger, who had directly enabled the Yorktown victory, was simply absent from those histories. It wasn't that historians didn't know about him. Lafayette's letters were preserved in archives. The Virginia General Assembly's act granting his freedom was documented. Military intelligence reports that mentioned him existed in various collections. But this information remained buried in archives, unexamined by popular historians, ignored by textbook writers, excluded from the narrative of American independence that the nation told itself. The reasons for this erasure were not mysterious. James's story complicated the comfortable mythology of the American Revolution. It raised uncomfortable questions about slavery, about how the nation treated its heroes, about whose contributions were remembered and whose were forgotten. Easier to simply omit him, to focus on white heroes whose stories supported the narratives Americans wanted to believe about themselves. For over a century, that's exactly what happened. The documents remained, scattered in archives across Virginia and beyond. Lafayette's letters praising James's intelligence work, legislative petitions with detailed descriptions of his espionage activities, military records that mentioned him in passing. The evidence existed, waiting for someone to look. But for generations, no one looked. Or if they looked, they didn't consider the information significant enough to integrate into dominant historical narratives. It wasn't until the mid-20th century as historians began excavating fuller, more complicated stories of the American Revolution that James Armistead Lafayette slowly emerged from historical obscurity. Researchers found Lafayette's testimonial letters and realized their significance. They discovered the legislative petitions and understood the extraordinary story they told. They pieced together intelligence reports and reconstructed the arc of James's espionage work. Slowly, painstakingly, his story was recovered from the silence that had buried it. A historical marker was erected in New Kent County in the 1970s. His name began appearing in textbooks, usually in sidebars or supplementary sections. Historians of African American contributions to the Revolution started, including him as a central figure. In 2007, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp bearing his image and honoring his service. These recognitions came more than 175 years after his death, but they came. Yet even now, his story remains largely unknown to general American audiences. Ask most people to name Revolutionary War spies and they'll mention Nathan Hale. Ask them about intelligence operations at Yorktown and they'll credit unnamed Continental officers or good fortune. Few know James Armistead Lafayette's name. Fewer still understand the full scope of his contribution. His grave remains unmarked, its exact location lost to time. The wooden cross that once stood over his burial site decayed decades ago. The Virginia soil holds his bones somewhere near New Kent County, anonymous among thousands of other unmarked graves. This is what historical erasure looks like in practice. Not the complete disappearance of evidence, the documents survive. The facts remain accessible to anyone willing to search archives, but the exclusion from collective memory, from national narrative, from the stories a society tells itself about its past. James Armistead Lafayette changed the course of American history. His intelligence work directly contributed to the victory at Yorktown, which effectively secured American independence. Without his contribution, the war might have lasted years longer, might have ended differently, might have produced a different nation entirely, and for 2 centuries, America forgot him. Erica. The silence speaks volumes about whose stories get remembered, whose contributions get celebrated, whose names get carved into monuments. It reveals the mechanisms of historical memory, not objective recording of truth, but selective construction of narratives that serve present purposes. James lived 20 years enslaved, fought for a freedom he was denied for 6 additional years, then spent 40 more years as a marginally free black man in a society built on the bondage of people who looked like him. He died without recognition, without honor, without his name appearing in any history of the war he helped win. But the documents remained. The truth persisted, waiting in archives, ready for anyone willing to look. And now finally we look. We remember. We acknowledge what was done, what was given, what was stolen. James Armistead Lafayette, the spy who changed America, but was erased from history. Until now. Until this moment, when his story is told again, when his name is spoken again, when his contribution is finally, belatedly, inadequately acknowledged, the soil of Virginia holds his bones somewhere unmarked and forgotten. But his story, his extraordinary, tragic, essential story, survives. And in that survival, there is a kind of justice, incomplete but real. His name was James Armistead Lafayette. He was a slave who became a spy who helped win a war for freedom he was denied. He deserved better than history gave him. But at least now, finally, his story can be told. 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 His story can be told.